So tonight, the fourth night of Chanukah, we thought we would focus in a little bit on something deeper regarding Chanukah, and maybe tie it into some relevant issues of today. So, what we're discussing is the language of the prayer Ala Nisim, which we insert into the davening and into the benching. And there's some interesting, the whole tefillah could be analyzed from many different perspectives. And this is from the Kedushas Levi, Rabbi Yitzchak, the Baram Digger of Berdichev, one of the great Hasidic Rebbes, who has a whole section in the Sefer dedicated to Chanukah. And here he discusses and he says, and we're not going to read all the parts inside, but just some of it. And now I'd like to explain Hanusach Shel Ala Nisim. Because we say, Masarta Giborim Biyad Chalashim. Hashem, you performed this great miracle. You gave over. You caused victory of the weak over the mighty. In other words, the mighty fell into the hands of the weak. V'rabim biyad mi'atim, and the many fell into the hands of the few. Utmeim biyad tahorim, and the impure fell into the hands of the pure. Ureshayim biyad tzadikim, and the wicked fell into the hands of the righteous. V'zeidim biyad oskei sarasacha, and the scoffers fell into the hands of those who study your Torah. So we're just going to translate. Hine lechora, it seems, giborim biyad chalashim, that's a miracle, because the mighty are supposed to win the battle. So when the weak win the battle, that's a miracle. The many in the hands of the few, that too is a miracle. But Rishayim in the hands of tzaddikim, why is that a miracle? Or Tameim biyad tahorim. Why is it such a miracle that the wicked would fall even into the hands of the righteous, as if there's some advantage to being wicked in terms of war? Venera. So says the Kedushas Levi, I'd like to suggest the following. The love that Hashem has for the Jewish people has an exceptional quality to it. For when a father loves his son, sometimes out of that great love, says the Kedushas Levi, the father will become outraged and angry at those who would hurt his son. And it doesn't make sense. How could he be using love to become angry? Love is supposed to create connection and warmth and kindness and all that. How can love create anger? So he quotes from Rav Dov Ber, that's his Rabbi, known as the Maggid of Mezrich, the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov is the founder of the Hasidic movement. His student was the Maggid of Mezrich, Rav Dov Ber. And he says, Shenikra Gevura Shebechesed. So he says, that's what we refer to as Gevura Shebechesed. That means that all 7 attributes, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, and so forth, are each made up of 7 attributes. That's why the 49 days of Sefirah, we go through 7 times 7. So if someone loves so much that the kindness turns into a Gevura, a strength, a severity, then that's what we call Gevura Shebechesed. Which means, we should point this out, Gevura Shebechesed, which means the strength within the kindness, is different than Chesed Shebegevura, which is the kindness within the strength. Because here we're saying that the attribute, the overwhelming feeling is the kindness and the love. But as a result of that feeling, it will sometimes translate itself into Gevura, into severity, despite the feeling being love. So he says here too, out of the great love that Hashem has for the Jewish people who are His children, He has to cut down and destroy and wipe out our enemies. So he says, therefore we have to make a very clear distinction. When Hashem destroys our enemies because they are wicked, he says that's referred to as Gevura Shebegevura, because Hashem's wrath against the wicked is Gevura, is strength, severity. And when that severity is punished with harshness, when the severity brings about harshness, that's the most severe of all attributes, Gevura Shebegevura, severity of severity, judgment of judgment, strength of strength. But when Hashem is doing it, out of the love that He has for the Jewish people, that's not Gevura Shebegevura, that's, as we said, Gevura Shebechesed. That's the foundation that the Kedushas Levi, or Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, lays out. So he says, that's why we say in the Nusach of Hanerus Alalu, you just said this as you lit candles, and you said, She'asisa lavisenu bayamim hahem azman hazeh al yidei kohanecha hakedoshim. Thank you, Hashem, for performing these miracles through your holy Kohanim. Why do you mention who the miracle was performed through? Why is it important? It doesn't even give a name. All it identifies them is by the group that they are from. So, there's a famous answer that's given because the famous Ramban who says that Chanukah is the Chanukah menorah is a extension of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore we want to invoke the Kohanim as we light our candles, maybe. But he says, and this is, I underline this, Shemidas Kohen hu bechesed. A Kohen is associated with chesed, as opposed to a Levi who's associated with Gevura. The Leviim are associated with Gevura throughout the Torah, the Kohanim are associated with chesed, and Yisrael is usually in between chesed and Gevura, or Tiferes. So the Kohen, that's why the Kohanim are the ones who do the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, because the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash is meant to bring down love, and Korban means closeness to Hashem. That's done through the Kohen. While the Leviim, their job are jobs of din and severity and judgment and strength, such as the guarding of the Beis HaMikdash, or the opening and closing of the doors, right? Sort of controlling who comes in and out, or even the music, which is mathematical and timed, that's associated with Gevura, with exactness, with precision. While the Kohanim, they're more free and in the world of Chesed. So he says, "Ve'enam ruyim la'orer nekamos u'gevuras." So Kohanim are never supposed to be the instruments to evoke feelings of vengeance or severity. Go look through the Torah and try to find a Kohen who led the Jewish people as a military leader. I mean, we had the Kohen who was Mashuach Muhammad, but he was more just making announcements. But a Kohen of war, we don't really find that. There's, of course, one famous exception. Well, there's a few, but the famous one is Pinchas. But Pinchas is by definition severity. He is the ultimate avenger of Hashem. He's actually not, he wasn't even born a Kohen, right? Or wasn't even made a Kohen. He only becomes a Kohen later. The answer is, because the story of Chanukah, where the Chashmonaim were Kohanim, their vengeance came mitoch ha'ahava she'ohev esamo b'nei Yisrael. It was all out of the love that Hashem loves the Jewish people, who no came nekamos b'tzarenu, He takes vengeance against our enemies. V'hu gevura shebechesed. Again, he says, therefore, Chanukah is about gevura shebechesed. The war of Chanukah is about gevura shebechesed, and that's why, beautiful pshat by the Kedushas Levi, Hashem specifically arranges that it should all happen through the Kohanim, so that we should not misunderstand and think that maybe the Greeks were rebelling against God and they were transgressing the will of God, and that's why they were wiped out. The fact that it happens through Kohanim means that they are channeling only chesed, and therefore the destruction of our enemies was only an act of love that Hashem has for the Jewish people. So he says that's why, to directly answer the question, that's why we say Naneres Halalu when we light the menorah, because we specifically want to connect the menorah to the Kohen, who is the instrument of chesed. And we say, we lit this. This was lit. This miracle happened through the lighting of the menorah by Kohanecha HaKedoshim, because we want to remind ourselves of the, not just of the miracle which occurred, but of the attribute represented by the miracle. And this is very important. There's a famous teaching from the Kedushas Levi in other places. The Gemara tells us that when the Chashmonaim won the war, they did not designate, they did not declare a Yom Tov of Chanukah. The language that the Gemara says, L'shana Acheres, the next year they got up and they declared the Yom Tov. So the question they ask is, if the miracle was big enough, the menorah burning for 8 days, or them winning the war, was a big enough miracle that they were inspired, you would think that they would be more inspired to establish a Yom Tov as the event was occurring than a year later. So the Kedushas Levi, and I'm going to connect what he says there to what he says here, says such an important principle that we have to remember this principle with every Yom Tov. We are not celebrating something which happened all those hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago. That's not what we're doing. We don't live in the past, and we're not commemorating something which is an event which is gone from us. The reason why we celebrate Yitzias Mitzrayim on Pesach is because Yitzias Mitzrayim is happening every year. And the reason why we celebrate the story of Purim is because the story of Purim is happening every year. So says the Kedushas Levi, when the miracle happened, of course it was a great miracle. But we're not going to declare a Yom Tov until the next year. They waited to see if those lights, if those influences, if those connections and powerful effects of a Yom Tov, of the miracle which happened the year before, if they could feel it the next year. And when they saw that they felt that inspiration and that light a year later, they said, this must be one of those things which is going to recur every year. That's the Kedushas Levi to explain that Gemara.
How would he distinguish this situation from that of Purim, where the holiday was declared in perpetuity by Esther?
Well, they were Nevi'im. They were prophets. So they didn't need to wait a year to understand the significance of the miracle. But there's no prophecy here. So these are just sages. So they needed to see, they needed confirmation that to know that they could declare it a holiday.
And what was the confirmation?
They felt it. They could feel, they could recognize the inspiration, the light, the meaning, the change in the air of the miracle which occurred last year. Somehow they were sensitive enough to it to be able to recognize it.
And they sensed it the following year, but not that year.
No, that year for sure they felt it, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen every year. So to see if it would recur, that's what would make it a Yom Tov. That's the Kedushas Levi. So what he's saying here is that Chanukah, whatever happened that year, what it gave was this influence of Gevura Shebechesed. And so it's not just something that happened then, but every year Chanukah is going to be about Gevura Shebechesed.
And who was it that had this feeling? The Kohanim?
We identify them in the Moaz Tzur song as B'nai Vina. Whoever the B'nai Vina are, and Bina actually means an intuition of sorts. B'nai Bina, Yemei Shmona, Kavu Shir Urinanim. So somehow these B'nai Bina, people who felt it, understood it, they declared it 8 days.
I mean, it's like, I think of like the Scud missiles when they came and nobody got hurt, or one person died of a heart attack, but it had nothing to do with the Scud missiles. Then, if the Gedolei Hador had feelings of, wow, this is, very powerful. I mean, it seems like most people didn't even recognize that that was a miracle.
No, absolutely, you're right. And it could be that there were people in the Chanukah story also felt that the war itself, it was good tactics. We had a good general. It was only when the menorah burned for 8 days that they sort of got shown that it was a miracle. But yeah, and the thing is, what we're saying is that it could be today we don't have anyone who's that sensitive to it. And it could be that's related to the issues of other holidays that people want to establish. The question is, do we really know what is something which is recurring and what isn't? But in the case of Chanukah, it is something which recurs every year. That's what the Kedushas Levi says.
The inspiration recurs every year?
Whatever influence from above comes down, whatever effect was happening, we might not use it properly or know how to channel it to make something of it, but if we needed that kind of miracle today, it would happen on Hanukkah.
Now, is there anything that you know of in history that maybe reflected a minute touch of it? I mean, like Tisha B'Av is different, that's definitely a different, but there are disasters that have happened at other times. Were there other slighter?
We would have to go through history. I'm not sure if we could do that. With Purim, for example, we do have all kinds of things which occurred on Purim. But do we have anything? The thing is, Chanukah is a much more spiritual influence rather than a physical influence. So it'd be hard to detect. You'd have to ask the scholars if they are exceptionally enlightened over Chanukah. And it could just be that it's the latkes, so it'd be hard to test.
The latkes?
Yeah.
Enlightened.
Right.
Oh, that's not enlightened. That would be in heavy.
Right. That's what I meant. So he says, back to the tefillah, he says, that's why we say, Hashem, you did this great miracle, and you gave Giborim biyad chalashim, v'rabim biyad miatim, the mighty into the hands of the weak, and the many into the hands of the few. And we said, well, that makes sense, but why finish with the righteous and the wicked into the hands of the righteous? What's the big deal about that? He says that's exactly what he's trying to say. And I'm going to read his language loosely. Kevan sheyesh tzadikim ba'olam, since there's righteous people in the world, and Hashem loves the righteous, and out of the love that He has for them, He took the vengeance. We want to make it very clear in the Ala Nisim that this was not that Hashem was destroying the wicked. Hashem was destroying the wicked for the righteous. This was not Gevura Shebigvura, Hashem destroying the bad people because they were bad. Hashem was destroying the bad people for the sake of the righteous people, for the sake of the tzaddikim. So he says that the miracle would then occur in the war related to the level of love that Hashem had with the people who were going to war. And so the miracle would reflect, basically, whoever was the bigger tzaddik would destroy more enemies, because that's the person who is really the catalyst for the miracle which is occurring. So he says, this helps us answer another question. We say, in the Ala Nisim, we say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you ravta es rivam. You quarreled their quarrel. Danta es dinam, you judged their judgment. Nikamta es nikmasam, you avenged their vengeance. That sounds like extra words. You should just say, Hashem, you quarreled for them, you judged for them, you avenged for them. But it says you avenged their vengeance. So he says, again, that's meant to teach you the same idea. That Hashem, in the miracle of Chanukah is not that Hashem took vengeance upon the enemies. It's that Hashem channeled through His love for us a destruction of our enemies. It was not through the attribute of din. And this is important, like we just said, because that means we're not bringing down din on Chanukah. There's no judgment we're bringing down. And by saying, you destroyed our enemies, destroy our enemies again. The destruction of the enemies was just a way of fulfilling the real midah of Chanukah, which is the love that Hashem has for the Jewish people. So, the fourth line from the bottom. V'lechein yemei Chanukah hema yemei chesed. Which means Chanukah is a time of chesed. There's actually a lot of customs that people have regarding giving tzedakah on Chanukah, and Chanukah is a time that you give Chanukah gelt. In America, for some reason, Chanukah gelt was switched and became giving gifts, which many poskim suggest that that's actually borrowed from another religion, which will remain unnamed. But it could be that it's a nice thing to give gifts, but to make Chanukah about gifts, that's an adjustment made by the modern Jew. Originally, the minhag always was Chanukah gelt, that parents, adults give money to children, and so it could be that one of the reasons why that is because Chanukah is we're supposed to reflect, and it could be gifts does the same thing, but I'm just saying that wasn't the original custom. But the point is that we should do acts of chesed on Chanukah, because Chanukah is about the bringing down chesed into the world. And again, without this Kedushas Levi, I would say on the contrary, chesed, we won a war. We fought a bloody battle, and we killed the hundreds of thousands of soldiers. What would that have to do with chesed? But if we realize that it's actually gevura shebechesed, but not only that, you see, it's a much bigger chesed, or let me say this differently. It's a much greater expression of love if I'm willing to go and fight someone for the person I love than for me to give something to the person I love. The father who wants to go beat up the guy who screamed at his children, so he shouldn't do that, that's not nice, but we all understand that that rage that he's experiencing is pure love. I mean, sometimes he just has anger management issues, but we're assuming where it's done out of love, that's actually a very powerful expression of love. And again, on the bottom line he says, Shekala mishpat b'malchis harisha, which means the entire judgment of this wicked kingdom. Machmas shenis orer az ava gedola la'amo b'nei Yisrael. There was a great love which was awakened for the Jewish people. L'chein heima yevei chesed. That's why it's days of chesed. Turning to the other page, he says that Chanukah being days of chesed, and I underlined this, shehagevura hi mitzad small. Everybody knows that Gevura, restriction, limitation, is associated with the weaker hand, the left hand. That's the hand that withholds or limits. And the hand of giving is the stronger hand, the right hand. For some people, that's the left hand, but the right hand is the limb of chesed. So he says, Aval osem shahaya b'mei Chanukah haya mitzad chasadim. Whereas we know Chanukah, the chesed, the vengeance which occurred is because of the chesed shenis orer ava li Yisrael. The next underline, ve'efshe shelachen haya hanes b'menorah. He says that's why the miracle happens specifically with the menorah. Because let's think about it. They go into the Beis HaMikdash and they do all kinds of things in the Beis HaMikdash. Why didn't they have that the Mizbeach's fire should have one korban burning for 8 days, or let the table, let the bread on the shulchan, on the lechem apanim on the shulchan, let it replenish itself. Let the ketores, which they light, the incense, let it burn for 8 days. Why the menorah?
Because the oil, it took 8 days to make more oil.
Well, you're right. It doesn't have to be 8 days. No, you're right. It doesn't have to be 8 days, but we just want something to continue. So let the ketores, which usually burns for a half hour, let it burn for a week.
But if you don't need it to because you have extra ketoret, then it doesn't serve much purpose. Then.
Right, but the way the commentaries seem to say it is that the menorah, they could have gone without lighting the menorah. That's one of the reasons why they say it's such a big miracle. It's because it's a miracle that was really without need. Okay, so if you don't have oil, you don't light the menorah. And it's so strange because usually Hashem goes out of his way not to make miracles in places where you don't need miracles. So Hashem will sometimes make it in such a strange way of nature in order to avoid a miracle. And here, that's the Chiddush of Chanukah. It's so different that Hashem goes out of his way to make a really I hate to use the word, but useless miracle, which does nothing except display a miracle. Because if you don't have oil, you just don't light the menorah. They haven't lit the menorah in years.
So what about ketoret? If you don't have ketoret, you just don't do
Right,
And if
right.
you don't have animals for zvachim, you don't have, so it's
Yeah.
the same thing for
In the
everything.
second
Yeah, so
temple,
then why this over
They
that?
didn't have some of the stuff anyway, so they did without it, right?
Right, that there were 5 things missing from
Yeah.
it. So what I'm saying is, why didn't Hashem do some miracle? Let man fall from the sky, and everyone will have what to eat. Why perform specifically the miracle in this way? Yes, there was a practical need for it, but it wasn't actually a practical need. It wasn't a need. It was just a spiritual.
I mean, I think I heard this somewhere, and it's not my own idea, but I think the menorah is emblematic of education and continuing on, and Masorah and so on, and what the Greeks really wanted to do was not to kill us, but to stop that.
Right. I think that's a fair suggestion. The whole approach of the menorah representing Torah Shabbal Peh,
Right.
as we know, the Aron,
Yeah.
which held the Luchos,
Right.
represents Torah Shebichsav. It held the Sefer Torah inside it as well, and that's locked away for nobody to touch. It's not available for us to tamper with our minds and to insert our interpretations and meanings. That's the Torah Shebiksav. And the menorah, which is the oil represents wisdom throughout the Talmud, and that represents Torah Shabbal Peh, and that's the one where I have to have my input, I have to keep burning it until the flame rises up, all these other things. So that's one approach.
Yeah.
But the Kedushas Levi is taking a different approach. He says, "Efshe shalachein hayanes b'menorah, shezeh korban Aaron kohen gadol." He says, "K'mavur b'Rashi parshas Ba'aloscha shub'midas hachesed." The answer is because, as we know, Aaron felt bad that he couldn't bring any of the karbanos on the first day, and Hashem says to him, "Don't worry, you'll have one every day with the menorah." So the menorah is a representation of Aaron and the Kohanim. So Hashem gives the miracle through the symbol of the Kohen
To the
in order to make this point that it's with Chesed. V'gam lechen hayanes b'menorah, the menorah b'darom, sheyadua shedarom b'midas hachesed, and says furthermore, the menorah the menorah actually represents Chesed. The menorah represents Chesed, the Shulchan represents Gevura, and the Mizbeach HaKetores represents Tiferes.
What does the Shulchan represent?
Gevura.
Oh.
Right, because it's Parnasa is cut and distinct in exact amounts and everything like that. So the menorah represents Chesed and flow and all of that, while the Shulchan, again, exact dimensions, and there's a whole discussion exactly how this works. So he's saying, not just because it's connected to Aaron, but because of the 4 directions, Darom is the side of Chesed and Tzafon is the side of Gevura. We're told that evil comes from the north. So the south.
We do that in Memphis for a long time.
Yes.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, very good.
War with me.
So he says, and therefore the days of Chanukah are Yemei Chesed, which bring Chesed down into the world. The Kedushas Levi goes on with this. We're not going to go through it, but he says this explains why the menorah is supposed to go on the left side of the door. A little complicated. We're going to leave that for now because I want to get to the points we're going to get to. So again, point number 1 is that the reason why we say we recite as part of Al Anisim, we say, Hashem, you even gave the mighty into the hands of the weak, and the many in the hands of the few, and the righteous, the wicked into the hands of the righteous. That last one is not to tell you an exception within the typical system, but rather to make the point that this was this was not just you destroyed the wicked, but that you destroyed the wicked for the sake of the good, and therefore the take home from that is that Chanukah, there should be an emphasis on what we would call Gevurah Shebechesed, or even without the Gevurah, there's an emphasis on Chesed. It's the Yom Tov of brought down through the Kohanim, the people who are Chesed, through the menorah, which is the Kli of Chesed. That's answer number one to this question.
If we stress Gevurah Shebechesed, then we would be getting angry at enemies. Like it would be a time of getting angry at people who are doing bad.
Righteous indignation.
Right.
Yes. According to this Kedushas Levi, there would be an element of that. He seems to be focused more. He starts off like that, but then he just focuses on the fact that they're Yemei Chesed. In other words, what the Kedushas Levi is saying is that we knew it's a time of Gevurah because it's war and destruction. We already know that. He's more shifting it and saying that you should not understand it as Gevurah. You should only understand it as Chesed, and the war was Gevurah Shebechesed. But the Shafa, which is coming down into the world, is really, its purpose is Chesed. Answer number two, and here I'm going to tell you outside these answers. Answer number two comes from Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman.
What's the question again?
Why we say the righteous in the hands of the wicked. I'm sorry, I keep saying that. The wicked in the hands of the righteous. So Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, ironically enough, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman is one of the great martyrs of the Jewish people who was killed by the Nazis, Yimach Shemo, along with almost his entire yeshiva. So he says that typically the wicked will win the war. Typically the wicked will win the war because all weapons being equal, there's something about a person who's willing to ignore all aspects of basic decency when fighting a battle for the sake of the edge. There are rules of engagement in war. And it's hard to win a war. It's hard to get what you want if you're dropping leaflets on the tops of people's houses saying, we're going to bomb this house in 10 minutes, get out. It's nice to do that, but it doesn't really, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I was saying that it does weaken a little bit the effect because your enemy isn't making announcements saying we're sending a bomb in that direction. Everyone, take cover. So,
do they do that at times of war, or do they do it at times of destroying someone's house because their child or whatever was incited a terrorist attack, or was
in which case?
The case of dropping the leaflets?
Well, they're dropping the leaflets because they feel that this building is either being used for as cover and people are shooting things out of there, or for some other reason that this building is being used the way it is.
Do they do that at the time of war, or do they do that when they're just at the time of peace?
The last time any nation has done that was during a war. That was considered a war. And they went in with their troops and they sent text messages to people saying, we're coming in, get out of the way. And they dropped leaflets and they made announcements to allow civilians to take cover. And many times they found, strangely enough, that the enemy would not allow people to escape, to follow these messages, because they wanted to be able to use any deaths of civilians as proof of war crimes, when actually they're the ones causing death. So says Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, there is something to being evil and winning a war. Dirty fighting methods do win wars. And so says Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, that's the pshat here. The Greeks were Rishaim. They knew not of mercy, they knew not of foregoing and letting go, and therefore it is a miracle that the wicked would fall into the hands of the righteous. That's answer number 2, given by Rabbi Chana Wasserman to this question.
But is that really true, that the wicked win the wars? It doesn't seem like that's true to me.
Technically, we're saying there's a miracle that the righteous people will win, but there is an advantage to being,
Nasty.
yes.
Well, and, I mean, it is correct, for example, at some of the surprise attacks, Blitzkrieg, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and some of these other kinds of things were not, like it isn't the good guys that start the war.
Right.
So they might have some victories in battle because they were unscrupulous. So I can understand what he's saying. Not that he needs my approval, but it makes sense to me.
Right.
Understand.
A third answer comes from Reb Chaim Kanievsky Shlita in Eretz Yisrael. He wants to suggest, this is an interesting pshat, I don't know exactly how it worked. He says that the Kohanim, the Maccabees, the Chashmonaim, not the Israeli football team, and not the a cappella band in Washington Heights, the Maccabees. He said that they actually knew that they were supposed to go back to the Beis HaMikdash and do the avoda, and so they tried to make sure not to become tamei by even through a Gentile death, which isn't the same severity of tumah of a Gentile dead body. So he says the Chashmonaim would use spears and arrows and avoid any direct hand-to-hand combat or even sword-to-sword combat.
So killing indirectly is okay? Like if you shoot somebody, it's
Well, you don't become tamei,
you don't become tummy?
right? Because
You're not killed?
you haven't touched the dead body. Which is, again, it's an interesting chat, but I find it almost impossible to imagine how you had a group. I mean, there were other soldiers as well, and maybe they just stood back as the archers. But to think that the Kohanim somehow they were maintaining the laws of Tumah and Tara in war, very strange thing indeed. But that's. I mean, they must have been. Eliezer, the son of Matisyahu, was killed by an elephant. They must have been in the thick of the battle. So, okay. But that's what.
Didn't they have the paraduma, the ashes to
Even if they did, it's a long process. It's a 7-day process to become pure. And even if you could become pure, a Kohen's supposed to try to avoid becoming tummy. So he's saying that because these Kohanim were at a self-proclaimed disadvantage, not self-proclaimed, but so therefore that's why it's a miracle. But I'd like to share with you one final pshat from Rabbi Avram Nesher, one of the old Chachmei Yerushalayim, who says probably the saddest pshat you've ever heard on Chanukah. Anu roim tamid, we always see that whenever there's fights and battles between the religious and the non-religious, or I should say anti-religious Jews, the anti-religious Jews typically win. Whenever there's a fight throughout Europe,
You mean
throughout
a physical fight or just
no, just they're attempting to make arrangements and to gather government support for something. He says, I look at our history and I see that the non-religious, and more correctly he says the anti-religious, will typically defeat the religious when it comes to, and you could say that it's a matter of numbers, but it's not really about numbers. There's something about the political clout that the anti-religious have. They have a greater influence.
because they usually are wealthier and they usually worm their way into the government, higher echelons?
He gives a different explanation. Ein lishpot mikach ki porke ha'ol chazaki mishomrei ha'mitzvos. He says, don't assume that they are somehow more talented or more capable than the religious. Ela al kach, the reason is the following, and I quote, Shelamar behatzar me'uchadim heim beineim b'milchamtam b'Hashem u'b'Torah, that despite the great difficulties involved, they unite against Hashem and His Torah. Yumin usmol, the right and their left, Osim shalom beinehem, make peace. B'chol pam shedavar nogea le'inyanim elu, when it comes to fighting the religious. V'yachad misyatzvim b'chazis me'uchedes, they stand together to hold back any accomplishment and any positive influence to religious Judaism and those who bear its flag.
So
He said
they make peace among themselves so that they can defeat.
they have a united front. He says,
Against the Orthodox.
Ach le'umazeh, against this, machne haYireim tamid mefuzar u'meforad. The religious Jews are always split amongst
I
themselves.
wondered if that's what you were going to get to.
Yes. And he
But
says,
they unite too when there's danger. And
not when we're battling the anti-religious.
Not when we're battling the anti-religious, but
Right.
when we're battling something.
Right? So when we are in a real serious panic,
Right.
when Haman declares that he's going to wipe out the Jewish people, lahashmid, laharog, la'abed, yeah, we got together then. La Yehudim Ma'isa Ayra v'simcha v'sasa v'ikar, yeah, that was awesome. But that doesn't happen. And the thing is, I'm going to add to his words, the anti-religious fight the battle against religious Judaism with the desperation of the Jews in the time of Purim who are about to be wiped out. They gather together and realize the seriousness of the situation. He says, but the religious, despite the recognition that we all have the same purpose, each one wants that when we accomplish what we accomplish, it should be done in their individual way. Thus, we go to war splintered. When we stand up against the united front on the other side of us, we do not stand a chance of victory in battle. He continues. It's unbelievable. Rabbi Avram Nesher, one of the Chachmei Yerushalayim of the previous century, he said, if the religious Jews would unite together for the sake of the protection of Judaism, just to come together, without focusing on their individual goals and agendas, without a doubt, we would be victorious. Hashem would be with us, and Hashem would support us. But as long as we're splintered, which one of us should Hashem support? Maybe He is supporting one of us, but we're all going for different things. Okay. And then he smacks us a little bit harder. And he says, the biggest miracle of Chanukah was that all the religious Jews united around Matisyahu, and none of them created their own agendas. Forget the winning of the war against the Greeks, that's nothing. Forget a menorah burning for 8 days, that's not a miracle. When he calls out, Mila Hashem Elai, and everyone gathers around him and they just listen to one leader and follow his words and accept him, and they're all fighting for one purpose, when the Jewish people come together to fight against the Greeks and the Hellenists, which means much of the battles were against fellow Jews, and they were united, the biggest miracle of Chanukah. So he says, that's why we say in our tefillah, Bimei Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Chashmonai Ubanav. So he says, that's a lot of words. The days of Matisyahu, the son of Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol, Chashmonai, and his sons. Now, we don't have to say in his sons, just say in his days. Obviously, his sons lived in his days, and they were fighting the battles with him. So you don't have to say in the days of him and in the days of his sons. So he says, what this is trying to tell you is that there was one leader. You could point to one person, it was the days of Matisyahu, because everyone else was just following him. Today, if you would say, well, ours is the generation of, can we pick one name and say today is the generation of which leader? Which leader are you going to say and point to? I can say 500 years ago, that was the time of the Arizal, the time of the Beis Yosef. I could pick specific names. I could say the days of the Rambam and the days of Rashi, just like you could say Bimei Matisyahu, but you can't say the days of anyone today. Because we're not together like that. Not only that.
Back in 100 years.
Well, he's saying we won't.
He's saying we won't.
We won't look back in 100 years and be able to point to whose days these were.
So what about 50 years ago, would you have said? the
Yeah, I don't
days
know.
of
He's
Moshe
writing
Feinstein?
this 100 years ago.
No, but I'm saying 50 years.
Yeah,
ago,
I don't think
Moshe
you would say
Feinstein-
that it was or Moshe Feinstein was around, but I don't think he was central enough to be able to accomplish this kind of individualization. Furthermore, he says it was the Kohen Gadol, he was the religious leader, and he says Ubanov, the reason why we say and his sons, is as if to say that everyone was just his sons. Everyone else was just listening. The younger ones, these are his words, the younger ones were accepting the words of the elders, not like it is today. None of them pursued that leadership. There's some debate as to whether they were supposed to become kings. He says, but no one else fought them. No one else stood up and said, hey, you shouldn't, because they were just so united. And therefore they won, despite the fact that they were weaker in the hands of the. They were weaker. They defeated the mighty, and they were few. They defeated the many. He says, and the chiddush is that even though they were righteous, and righteous people have trouble coming together, still they were able to come together. That's a miracle. Again, very, very harsh words that he's saying, and there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there as well. He's saying that the greatest miracle of Chanukah was that the Jewish people united together. And he finishes this explanation with Umi Yitein v'yiyeh kach b'yameinu. Who would give? And he's writing this in Yerushalayim 100 years ago, when this would have been the dream for the Jewish people to have come together and to have established the state of the Jewish people in a way which was a united front. If the religious Jews would have all gotten together and come together with one purpose.
Was there ever another time in history when the Jews were united?
We were. You have Ish Echad Kalev Echad Behar Sinai, and you've got the Purim story, but
Yeah, but then there's no splintering because they just came out of slavery.
Right. I don't know if we could ever point to, although we don't have that many wars, but we don't really have a time when one person said, gather around me, like, come, and people just followed him, and nobody said, well, hey, they've got this group fighting a war, I'm a pretty good religious leader too, I should open my own shul, or a battle camp. And they didn't have that. Nobody did it because they just came together, and he says that's why they won the war. If the Jewish
Warsaw
people...
Ghetto. Somebody must have gotten up and said...
The numbers were not big. You did not have the entire ghetto fight. They couldn't even get in enough weapons to be able to do that. So, running out of time, so I just want to repeat just quickly these four explanations. The first was this beautiful Torah from the Kedushas Levi about how Chanukah is, even though it looks like it's all about Gevura, it's all Chesed. It's a greater chesed than other times. And he explained all these things that are happening. That's why it's the Kohanim. That's why it's the menorah, which is the right side, which is associated with the Kohanim, which is chesed. That's why we say Raftes Rivam Dantes Dinam. That's why we stress it was Kohanecha HaKadoshim. All these explanations which he says can only be understood once you understand that Chanukah is about chesed. The second explanation we saw was from Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who said there actually is an advantage to being wicked because people like that have no standards. They don't follow the rules of engagement, and that gives them, in terms of battle, it gives them the slight advantage. That's actually why they do it. And yet, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, despite that the Greeks were dirty fighters, Hashem still gave them over. That's what it means. Rishayim B'yad Tzadikim means that the righteous people who stuck to being good and kind, even in times of war, they won the battle against the people who didn't care how casualties fell. The third explanation we saw was from Chaim Kanievsky that somehow there was a miracle that the Kohanim were able to avoid becoming Tameh, and that's what we mean, Tameh B'yad Tahorim, or Shem B'yad. Actually, it's interesting because we actually use those words, Tameh B'yad Tahorim. But the fourth, and perhaps, as I said, the saddest Pshat in Chanukah you've ever heard, was that he said the greatest miracle of Chanukah was that Matisyahu led the Jewish people, and they united around him, and that the Jewish people came together as one. And he says that he sees, he saw this, he was living at a time when the reason why the religious Jews were losing all the battles against the anti-religious was because they were unable to unite. And he said he sees that if they, again, Jews are Jews, it's going to be the same in every generation. So I just want to tie this in back to the first pshat. We know that chesed, kindness, is associated with love, as the Kedushas Levi told us. And it could be, maybe because there was such a powerful Avas Yisrael that was coming down from Hashem towards the Jewish people, where Hashem was destroying the enemies not in order to because they were bad. They were bad, but that's not why Hashem was destroying them. But Hashem, as the Kedushas Levi told us, was specifically being ma'orer, awakening His love for the Jewish people. So maybe that's the cause for why the Jewish people felt this purpose of coming together and united. They increased their Avas Yisrael because Hashem was inspiring them. That's the shefa, that's the flow of Chanukah. If that's the case, then maybe Chanukah is the time when we should, not the gvura shebechesed, but just focusing on the chesed. Maybe Chanukah is the time that we should focus on uniting ourselves in trying to accomplish for the sake of Torah, and not everyone having their own agendas and their own plans and their own hashkafas of how things should be. But maybe Chanukah is the time when we all need to come together and form a united front. May we be zocha that through the light of Chanukah and through our efforts in bringing down the lights and all the influences of Chanukah, that maybe the Jewish people should have a little more peace amongst those people who are working to promote the Torah of Hashem, through those who are working to try to promote religious observance throughout the world. Hashem should give them the koach to have shalom, peace between them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.